After she left, I sat in that sitting room for hours, watching the rain streak down the windows and trying to process what had just happened. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes with mechanical indifference, and I found myself counting the beats like a countdown to my own destruction. Because I knew Imogen would follow through. She'd present her case to my parents with tears in her eyes and heartbreak in her voice, painting herself as the reluctant messenger who only wanted to protect the family from scandal. She'd frame her coup as an act of love. And they would believe her. 3 days later, I learned just how right I'd been. The summons came in the form of a text from my mother. Please come to the drawing room. Your father and I need to speak with you. The drawing room. Not the kitchen where we usually had our family conversations. Not the cozy study where Dad helped me with homework throughout school. The drawing room was where serious family business was conducted, where ancestors in oil paintings looked down with disapproving eyes and every word carried the weight of generations. They were waiting for me like a tribunal. Mum sat rigidly in her usual chair, the one that had been her mother's, her face a mask of disappointment and barely controlled emotion. Dad stood by the fireplace, his barrister's posture radiating authority and judgment. Between them, on the coffee table, sat a manila folder that I somehow knew contained my doom. Sit down, Penelope, Dad said, and the formal use of my full name sent ice through my veins. I perched on the edge of the sofa, the same spot where I'd sat for every serious conversation of my childhood. The talk about periods, the discussion about university choices, the gentle lecture about responsibility that came with privilege. But this felt different. Final. We've had some very disturbing information brought to our attention, Mum began, her voice tight with pain. About your behavior at Cambridge. About choices you've been making. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but Dad held up a hand. Please don't compound this by lying to us. We have evidence. Evidence. The word hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Dad opened the manila folder and began laying out photographs on the coffee table. Pictures of me at various locations around Cambridge, but contextualized in ways that made innocent moments look sordid. Me leaving Professor Morrison's office late one evening, because we'd been discussing my thesis. Me at a pub with a group that included several older graduate students, twisted into evidence of inappropriate relationships. Me looking exhausted and disheveled after a particularly brutal exam period, presented as proof of drug use. Imogen was devastated to bring this to us, Mum said, tears actually streaming down her cheeks. She's been worried about you for months, apparently. Trying to help you, trying to be supportive, but she finally realized she couldn't enable your destructive behavior any longer. She loves you so much, Dad added, his voice heavy with emotion. She's willing to do whatever it takes to help you get the support you need. The support I needed, it turned out, included immediate enrollment in a private rehabilitation facility that specialized in young people from good families who'd lost their way. It also included voluntary withdrawal from my doctorate program, cessation of all contact with my Cambridge social circle, and temporary suspension of my access to the trust fund pending a full investigation into my conduct. We're not doing this to punish you, Mum said through her tears. We're doing this because we love you. Because we can't bear to watch you destroy yourself. I sat there, surrounded by fabricated evidence of crimes I'd never committed, watching my parents mourn for a daughter who'd never existed while the real me became invisible. Every attempt to explain was met with a gentle, pitying resistance of people who believed they were saving someone from their own delusions. The program starts on Monday, Dad said finally. Imogen has offered to help us get you settled in. She's been researching facilities for weeks, apparently. Found one in Scotland that comes highly recommended. Scotland. Far enough from London that I'd be effectively exiled, cut off from anyone who could vouch for my real character or contradict Imogen's carefully constructed narrative. I won't go, I said quietly. You don't have a choice, Dad replied, and for the first time in my life, his voice was cold when he spoke to me. Either you go voluntarily, or we'll have you sectioned. Dr. Whitmore has already reviewed the evidence and agrees that intervention is necessary. Dr. Whitmore. Our family physician, who'd treated me for childhood ailments and teenage anxieties, who'd known me since I was born. Even he had been turned against me. I excused myself and went to my room, claiming I needed time to process. But what I really needed was to understand how thoroughly I'd been destroyed. I pulled out my phone and started making calls, to friends at Cambridge, to professors, to anyone who might serve as a character witness. The responses were worse than I'd imagined. Professor Morrison, my thesis supervisor, was concerned about some irregularities he'd noticed in my work and thought perhaps some time away would be beneficial. Friends reported having received phone calls expressing concern about my well-being, calls that had planted seeds of doubt about my stability. Even my closest friend, Tabitha, seemed uncertain. "I mean, Penny, you have been under a lot of pressure," she said when I called her in tears. And Imogen seemed genuinely worried when she rang me. "Maybe taking some time to sort yourself out isn't such a bad idea." Imogen had been thorough. Systematic. She'd spent months laying the groundwork, making casual phone calls that sounded like concerned family reaching out, sharing carefully edited photos and selectively quoted conversations. By the time she made her formal accusations to my parents, the supporting evidence was already in place. I was trapped in a narrative that painted my every protest as further proof of my instability. The more desperately I denied her accusations, the more my parents saw confirmation of someone spiraling out of control. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out how my life had been stolen from me so completely. Imogen had played a game I hadn't even known we were playing, using weapons I'd never learned to wield. She understood that in families like ours, perception was reality, that reputation was everything, and that once doubt was planted, it grew like a cancer. But lying there in the dark, something else began to grow alongside my despair. Determination. If Imogen thought she could destroy me with lies, she was about to learn that I'd inherited more than just my father's intellectual rigor. I'd also inherited his methodical approach to building a case. And I was going to build one hell of a case against my cousin. The next morning, I became a detective investigating my own life. I started with my phone, screenshotting every conversation I'd had with Imogen over the past year, every social media interaction, every photo she'd been tagged in. What I found was a pattern of subtle manipulation that was breathtaking in its sophistication. She'd been gathering intelligence for months. Comments on my Instagram posts that seemed supportive but were actually fishing for information about my schedule. Questions about my relationships that appeared to come from friendly interest but were clearly designed to identify potential weak spots in my reputation. Even her visits home had been reconnaissance missions, opportunities to observe my habits and relationships up close. But Imogen had made one crucial mistake. She'd underestimated my intelligence. While she'd been busy crafting her web of lies, I'd been documenting my real life without even realizing it. Digital footprints, academic records, witness statements from professors and classmates. All of it painted a picture that completely contradicted her accusations. The photographs she'd presented as evidence were real, but their context had been deliberately distorted. The compromising situation with Professor Morrison? I could prove it was a group study session by cross-referencing it with library records and other students' social media posts from that evening. The drug use evidence? Screenshots of my fitness tracker showed I'd been running 10 kilometers that morning. Hardly the behavior of someone struggling with substance abuse. More damaging to her case was what I found when I started digging into Imogen's own recent activities. Financial records showed she'd been burning through Uncle Richard's allowance at an alarming rate. Her social media revealed a lifestyle of expensive restaurants, designer shopping, and luxury travel that didn't align with her claims of being a struggling artist. Most tellingly, I found evidence of gambling debts that explained her sudden desperation for additional family resources. But the smoking gun came from an unexpected source. Imogen herself. She'd always been careless with technology, the type of person who left her phone unlocked and her laptop open. During her last visit, she'd used our home Wi-Fi and forgotten to log out of her cloud storage account on the family computer. When I checked the browser history, I found drafts of emails she'd never sent, detailed plans for her campaign against me, complete with timelines and strategic considerations. One draft, dated 2 months before her accusations, was particularly illuminating. Must be careful with timeline, can't make it seem too sudden or they'll suspect coordination. Need at least 6 weeks of growing concern before bringing formal evidence. Photos from Cambridge visit should be enough to establish narrative, but will need supporting witness statements. Consider approaching Tabitha. First, she's always been insecure about Penny's success and might be receptive to suggestions about concerning behavior. There were pages of it. Cold, calculated planning that treated my destruction like a military campaign. She'd identified my vulnerabilities, mapped my social connections, and systematically poisoned every well I might have drunk from. It was sociopathic in its thoroughness. But it was also her undoing. I spent the weekend building my countercase with the same methodical precision Dad had taught me during childhood games of chess. Every lie documented and disproven. Every manipulation exposed and contextualized. Every piece of Imogen's evidence revealed as carefully constructed fiction. By Sunday evening, I had enough proof to bury her. But I wanted more than vindication. I wanted justice. And for that, I needed her to hang herself with her own rope. Monday morning came with crisp autumn sunlight that made the whole world look newly washed. I was supposed to be on my way to Scotland, but instead, I was preparing for war. I found my parents in the breakfast room, both looking older than they had just days before. The stress of their daughter's troubles had carved new lines around their eyes, had bent their shoulders with the weight of disappointment and worry. "I'm not going to Scotland," I announced, setting my laptop on the table between the jam pots and morning papers. "Penelope," Dad began, his voice carrying that warning tone I remembered from childhood. "No, Dad. You're going to listen to me. Both of you. Because your beloved niece has been playing us all for fools." Mum's face went white. "How dare you try to blame Imogen for your own?" "Because she's been lying about everything." I opened my laptop and began my presentation with the calm, measured tone I'd learned from watching Dad in court. "And I can prove it." For the next hour, I laid out my evidence piece by piece. The timeline inconsistencies in Imogen's stories. The digital records that proved my whereabouts during the time she claimed I was behaving inappropriately. The academic records that showed my thesis progress had been exemplary throughout the period she'd claimed I was spiraling. But the real bombshell was Imogen's own emails. "She's been planning this for months," I said, reading from the drafts I'd found. "Every conversation, every visit, every expression of concern. It was all calculated to position herself as your preferred daughter while destroying my reputation." I watched my parents' faces change as the reality hit them. The progression from defensive disbelief to growing uncertainty to horrified realization was almost painful to witness. "This can't be right," Mum whispered. She was so concerned, so heartbroken about having to tell us. "Because she's an excellent actress," I replied. "She's been performing for you her entire life, and you've been such an appreciative audience that she thought she could stage my downfall as her greatest role." Dad was studying the evidence with his lawyer's eye, checking sources and cross-referencing details. I could see the exact moment when professional skepticism overcame paternal emotion. "My God," he breathed. "She's really done this. She's actually destroyed your daughter's reputation and nearly cost her everything for money," I finished. "Yes, she has." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 years of family dinners and Christmas mornings, of shared holidays and birthday celebrations, all suddenly recontextualized through the lens of Imogen's calculated jealousy. "We need to speak with her," Mum said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I agreed. "We do." Imogen arrived that afternoon dressed for the part of the grieving cousin, all muted colors and sympathetic expressions. She'd probably expected to find my parents in pieces, grateful for her support during their family crisis. Instead, she found them sitting together on the sofa with my laptop open between them, every one of her lies spread out in neat digital rows. "Uncle William, Aunt Catherine," she began, but her voice faltered when she saw their faces. "Sit down, Imogen," Dad said, and his courtroom voice could have frozen fire. She sat, but I could see her mind racing, trying to calculate how much we knew and whether the situation could still be salvaged. "We've been reviewing some interesting evidence this afternoon," Mum said, her usual warmth replaced by Arctic chill. "About Penelope's supposed behavior at Cambridge." "Oh," Imogen said carefully. "I know it must be difficult to process, but actually, what's difficult to process is how our niece could sit in our home and fabricate such elaborate lies about our daughter." Dad's voice cut across her attempted explanation like a blade. I watched Imogen's face cycle through her usual repertoire of expressions: confusion, hurt, defensive indignation, before settling on wounded innocence. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," she said, but her voice was pitched just slightly too high. "I'm suggesting," I said, speaking for the first time since she'd arrived, "that you're a liar and a fraud who spent months planning to destroy my life so you could position yourself as the golden child." "Penny!" Her eyes widened in perfectly performed shock. "How can you say such things? I was only trying to help you." "Help me." I stood up, and 23 years of suppressed frustration finally found its voice. You call systematic character assassination helping me? You call manipulating our parents into believing I'm a drug-addled failure helping me? I never said. You said plenty. I pulled up the email drafts on my phone. Would you like me to read your own words back to you? The part where you wrote about needing to establish narrative? Or the bit where you strategized about approaching my friends to plant seeds of doubt? The color drained from her face, and for the first time since I'd known her, Imogen looked genuinely afraid. Those emails, she began, are in your own cloud storage, complete with timestamps and metadata, Dad finished coldly. We've already had them verified by IT forensic specialists. But I was. She was grasping now, the smooth performance cracking under pressure. You were what? Mum asked, and I'd never heard such ice in her voice. Protecting the family? Looking out for Penelope? Or were you desperately trying to secure your own financial future by destroying hers? Because we know about the gambling debts, I added quietly. And the credit cards, and the fact that Uncle Richard has threatened to cut you off unless you prove you can be responsible with money. Imogen's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely. The tears that came now weren't the controlled, strategic ones she'd perfected for maximum emotional impact. These were ugly, desperate, real. You don't understand, she sobbed. I never meant for it to go this far. I needed them to see that I could be trusted too. That I could be the responsible one for once. So you tried to destroy me? I asked, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected. You thought the best way to prove your worth was to fabricate evidence that I was worthless? It wasn't supposed to be permanent, she cried. I thought you'd get help, prove that the stories weren't true, and everything would go back to normal. But you'd have learned what it felt like to not be perfect for once. The honesty was more devastating than any of her lies had been. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a single bad decision. This was the product of years of resentment, of watching me succeed while she struggled, of feeling overlooked and undervalued in a family that prized achievement above almost everything else. Get out, Mum said quietly. Aunt Catherine, please. Get out of our house, Mum repeated louder this time. And don't come back. Uncle William. You heard her, Dad said. You're no longer welcome here. And we'll be contacting your father about your behavior, as well as the trust administrators. If you think your lies nearly cost Penelope her inheritance, wait until they learn about your gambling debts and fraud attempts. Imogen left without another word, but not before shooting me a look of pure hatred that revealed more truth about her character than any of her previous performances. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Imogen's manipulation came to light. She'd contacted not just my parents and friends, but also several professors at Cambridge, trust administrators, and even potential employers in the publishing world. Her campaign had been comprehensive and nearly successful. If not for her own arrogance in documenting her plans, she might have gotten away with it entirely. The rehabilitation facility in Scotland had to be contacted and told that their incoming patient was no longer coming. My doctorate program, which I'd been pressured to withdraw from, welcomed me back with apologies and support. The trust fund administrators, after reviewing the evidence of Imogen's fraud, not only cleared my name but also flagged her own account for investigation. Most importantly, my relationship with my parents slowly began to heal. The damage wasn't something that could be erased overnight. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild, but they were willing to do the work. They attended family therapy sessions, learned to question their own assumptions, and gradually came to understand how their favoritism and high expectations had created the environment that allowed Imogen's jealousy to fester. We should have seen it, Mum said during one particularly difficult session. The signs were all there. The way she always tried to diminish your accomplishments, the subtle undermining disguised as concern. She was very good at it, I admitted. She knew exactly how to play on your fears and prejudices. Dad, who'd spent his career reading people and detecting deception, was perhaps the most shaken by how completely he'd been fooled. I built my reputation on being able to spot lies, he said. How did I miss this? Because you wanted to believe the best of her, I replied. And because she used your love for me against you. She made you think that believing her lies was protecting me. The conversation we had that day was the most honest we'd ever shared as a family. No polite avoidance of difficult topics. No maintenance of comfortable illusions. Just raw truth about favoritism and expectations. About the pressure of being the perfect child and the corrosive effects of feeling perpetually overlooked. We put too much pressure on both of you, Mum admitted. You to always be exceptional. Her, to compete with someone who seemed effortlessly successful. We created this situation as much as she did. It was a hard truth to swallow, but an important one. Imogen's actions were inexcusable, but they hadn't happened in a vacuum. They were the product of a family dynamic that had been toxic long before any of us realized it. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new flat in Bloomsbury, the morning sun streaming through windows that were entirely my own, when the phone rang. Penny. The voice was smaller than I remembered, stripped of its usual performative confidence. It's Imogen. I'd wondered if this moment would come. Whether she'd eventually reach out, whether there would be an attempt at reconciliation or just another manipulation dressed up as family obligation. What do you want? I asked. I wanted to apologize, she said, and for once, she sounded genuinely uncertain. For everything. For what I did to you, to Uncle William and Aunt Catherine. For how far I let it go. Apologize. I almost laughed. You tried to destroy my entire life. Imogen. You nearly cost me my education, my family, my future. An apology seems rather inadequate. I know, she said quietly. I know it does. But I need you to understand that I never meant. You never meant to get caught, I interrupted. There's a difference. The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of everything that couldn't be undone. I've been getting help, she continued finally. Real help. Therapy, financial counseling, looking at why I felt so desperate to prove myself. Good for you. And I've been working. Actually working, not just pretending to be an artist. I'm paying Dad back for the debts, trying to make amends where I can. Despite everything, I found myself curious about this version of Imogen, the one without pretense or performance, the one who'd been forced to confront the ugliness of her own actions. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because I wanted you to know that it wasn't about you. Not really. It was about me feeling like I was drowning in your shadow, like I could never be enough in a family that valued achievement above everything else. That doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing could excuse that. But I wanted you to understand that it came from my own inadequacy, not from anything lacking in you. It was, I realized, the first completely honest thing she'd ever said to me. And also because I wanted to tell you that I'm grateful, she continued. Grateful that you fought back, that you exposed what I'd done. Because if you hadn't, I would have kept going down that path until I destroyed myself as thoroughly as I tried to destroy you. We talked for another 20 minutes, a conversation that was part confession, part therapy session, part funeral for the relationship we'd never actually had. By the end of it, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. Imogen had spent her entire life performing roles she thought would make people love her, never learning to value herself enough to be authentic. The irony was that in trying to steal my life, she'd finally been forced to examine her own and find it wanting. I don't forgive you, I told her before we hung up. I'm not sure I ever will. But I hope you find a way to build something real for yourself. Something that doesn't require tearing other people down. I'm trying, she said. And Penny? For what it's worth. You always were everything I wanted to be. I just never learned how to want it for the right reasons. A year has passed since that phone call, and my life has found its new rhythm. I completed my doctorate with a thesis that examines the role of deception in contemporary family narratives. Art imitating life in the most unexpected way. The publishing house that had been interested in my work before Imogen's campaign ultimately offered me a position as an acquisitions editor, specializing in debut literary fiction. My relationship with my parents has evolved into something more honest and less performative. We still have dinner every Sunday, but the conversations are different now. More real, less concerned with maintaining the illusion of perfection. Mum has started therapy to address her own relationship with control and expectations. Dad has become an advocate for family mediation in his professional work, drawing on our experience to help other families navigate complex dynamics before they turn destructive. Uncle Richard, after learning the full scope of his daughter's deception, made the difficult decision to cut her financial support entirely. She needs to learn who she is when she's not playing a role, he told my parents. Even if that process is painful for all of us. Imogen, from what I hear through the family grapevine, is working as a teaching assistant at a primary school in Manchester and sharing a flat with 2 other women. It's not the glamorous life she'd always imagined for herself, but according to Uncle Richard's cautious reports, she seems more grounded than she's ever been. I don't hate her anymore. Hate requires energy I'd rather spend on building the life she tried to steal from me. But I also don't trust her, and I probably never will. Some betrayals cut too deep to fully heal, leaving scars that serve as permanent reminders of lessons learned too late. The trust fund was released to me on my 25th birthday, along with a formal letter from the administrators apologizing for the distress caused by their investigation. I used part of it to buy my flat in Bloomsbury, part to establish a scholarship fund for first-generation university students, and part to take Mum and Dad on a holiday to Italy. The first time in years that we'd traveled together as a family. But perhaps the most valuable thing I gained from this experience wasn't money or vindication. It was the knowledge that I could survive being completely misunderstood by the people who mattered most to me and still find a way to rebuild on my own terms. There's a particular strength that comes from having your entire world collapse and discovering that you're still standing when the dust settles. It's the strength of knowing that you can lose everything, reputation, family support, financial security, and still find a way to construct something beautiful from the wreckage. I think about that sometimes, when I'm editing manuscripts about family dysfunction or personal betrayal. How many stories like mine exist in the world? How many people have found themselves on the wrong side of a narrative they didn't even know was being written? The phone calls with Imogen stopped after that single conversation. We see each other at Christmas and Easter, maintaining the polite fiction of family harmony for the sake of our parents and Uncle Richard. She's quieter now, less performative, though I sometimes catch her watching me with an expression I can't quite read, part regret, part lingering resentment, part curiosity about the person I've become in the aftermath of her destruction. I've started dating someone, a fellow editor named Benedict who finds my family story fascinating rather than scandalous. It's like something out of a Victorian novel, he said when I first told him about Imogen's campaign. All that plotting and scheming over inheritance and family position. Yes, but with digital evidence and therapy instead of duels and consumption, I replied, and he laughed in a way that made me realize how good it felt to have someone who could find humor in my tragedy without minimizing its impact. The final chapter of this story is still being written, but I know how I want it to end. Last month, I received a call from a literary agent who'd read my thesis and was interested in representing me for a potential book deal. Family dysfunction narratives are incredibly popular right now, she explained. And your academic perspective combined with personal experience could be very compelling. I'm considering it. Not because I want to profit from my family's pain, but because I think there's value in examining how easily we can be manipulated by people who understand our emotional vulnerabilities. How love can be weaponized, how trust can be exploited, how the very bonds that should protect us can become the tools of our destruction. But if I do write that book, it won't be a revenge narrative or a simple story of good triumphing over evil. It will be a complex examination of how families create the conditions for their own dysfunction, how privilege and pressure can distort relationships beyond recognition, and how sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's destructive behavior. Because that's what we should have done with Imogen years ago. Instead of enabling her performances, we should have demanded authenticity. Instead of competing for approval, we should have insisted on honesty. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to participate in their self-destruction. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give yourself is learning that you're strong enough to survive, even when the people who should love you unconditionally choose to believe lies instead. My cousin spread lies about me to get favor with my parents. But in the end, all she managed to do was reveal the truth about herself, and teach me that I'm capable of rebuilding from ashes, stronger and more authentic than before. The story isn't over yet. But for the first time in my life, I'm the one writing it.